Right, so to create one of these pillars, it is actually quite easy. And now we can take two approaches, a geometry-based approach and a shader-based approach, right? So the first one is going to end up with more geometry, and the second one is going to end up with a lot less geometry, right? So for example, the first one you could make a circle and move that to the X direction, right? This is the foundation of the pillar. And we can go into edit mode, press 1, F3, checker deselect. That's gonna deselect every other vertex. And we can just press S to scale that down, right? So we just get a little bit of that pattern. Press A, E, Z, scale that down a little bit, right? So that will be the foundation of the vertical part. Now, to create, for example, these little edges there, we can, for example, just add some edge loops, Ctrl R, add a few more, add another one there, 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 and then we could just extrude these little ridges inwards. That is quite an easy approach. All right, so we could select all of these, E, escape, Alt S, just scale that inwards, right? So then you would have that little shadow there. And now another way to do this is with shading, right? Right now we would have, for example, 320 vertices, and you will end up with even more if you want more of the geometry, right? So I'm just gonna delete this and Shift A, mesh, circle, and we can just set the vertices to be quite low, like 8. Or maybe let's go with 10 actually, otherwise it's gonna look too much like a hexagon. 10 would work okay for now, right? So I'm gonna extrude this up now in the edit mode, EZ, and let's scale this down, right? So we are gonna work with the entire pillar because we want as little geometry as possible. And we may have to make two variants at some points, right? Because some of them have a little bit of an offset, which is easy enough as well, right? So we can just do it like this. And we can now go into the shader editor. Right mouse, shade this smooth so we get a circular kind of look. And if it is still too harsh in shading, we have to go to the data and set the smooth to something like 60. And there we go, right? Looking cylindrical. And we can even add this, increase this, doesn't really do much, just to make sure, right? So now in the shader, we're gonna do pretty much everything here, right? So let's go to render view and let's hit new. And now we're gonna tweak the shader here, right? So first things first, because we have a cylindrical shape, and the things that we want to achieve, like these vertical lines, they're usually not really gonna work that well if we don't UV unwrap this, right? Because our cylinder is also lofted, right? The top is smaller than the base. It is usually going to be crooked, and our textures are not going to line up properly. So we're going to fix that by first UV unwrapping this, right? So let's go into edit modes and let's just select one of these edges. And you can see this as a folded piece of paper, a rolled up piece of paper, right? If you have an A4 paper and you roll it up, you end up with a cylinder, right? So how is a cylinder looking unwrapped? It's basically a rectangle, right? So we need to cut one of these edges or mark that as a seam, so Blender knows at what point it can actually like unfold it, right? So if I now press A, U, and unwrap, it's gonna unwrap it as an actual rectangle. Now this is not a perfect rectangle, that is a little bit annoying, so we can fix that by making one of these quads beautiful, right? Make it all straight. So let's select the middle one and select these two top vertices, SY0, same for the bottom two, SY0, left 2, SX0, and the right 2, SX0 as well. Reason why we do this is because if we have one quad that is properly aligned, right, so that means the top and the bottom are nicely horizontal and the vertical one's nicely vertical, we can select everything and press right mouse, and let's just select that middle one last, right mouse, follow active quads. There we go. Beautifully unwrapped like a rectangle, and now that can be used in the shader editor. And if you hear something rumbling in my background, one of my cats is being weird. I hope it's not too loud. Let's go to the shader editor and let's fix these vertical lines first, right? So you may already know how to, right? The easiest approach here is if we just use a wave texture. Shift A, search for a wave texture. Here we go. And let's just connect that right into the surface. Ctrl Shift click it so we can see how it looks. Now by default, the wave texture is going to be having the input of the generated tile of the texture coordinate, right? If you want this to appear, Ctrl T on the wave texture. And you can play around with these settings, but UV works best for this one, right? Because we unwrap this nicely. Now just make sure that you don't really see something weird going on at the seam, right? So we can just scale this up because we need a bit more of those vertical lines. So let's scale this up to right about there. Something like that. And that looks proper, right? That looks quite all right. Now let's just connect that right into the normal. Ctrl Shift click on the print spot, Shift A, bump. And instead of having the wave texture going into the normal, we want it into the height, because the height section of the bump node uses a black and white input. And our black and white wave texture will basically control the bump, right? Will control the height of that bump. Something like this, right? And we can even drag this all to the left, Shift A, color ramp, swap it in between, and Ctrl Shift click that. And we can now control pretty much how this looks, right? So we could even have a little black edge that is that ridge, and we could then add another white color on the left there, and we could play around with that, right? So there's a lot of ways we can really define the pretty much bump map there, right? So that's a little bit of personal preference as well. Okay, so we could drag this more to the left, more to the right. I'm going to try to get that nice and centered there, something like this. And now I pretty much want these hard black lines to be the pointy bits. We could even try B-spline to get a bit of a softer result. And now if you Ctrl Shift click back on the principal BSDF, we can see that it's looking a bit weird, but we can tweak that by just setting the strength or the distance a little bit lower. And I want the distance to be a bit lower, so I'm going to just decrease that slightly like that. And now we may just have to scale this down a bit, maybe 10. Something like that looks quite decent, I would say. Let's try to invert this. Nah, that doesn't look good. So we're gonna stick with this, right? Distance, let's just set that back to 1. Because I'm gonna add something else in that bump node later. So we are gonna tweak that color with the color ramp alone, right? Which means that we just have to bring those black and white values closer. And instead of playing around with this one, we can just add a new color ramp. Because this is now easier to control. We can just increase the blacks a little bit more to the white, and we can get the whites a bit closer to the blacks. All right, so at some point you will have them as close as it will show a nice soft bump map there, right? And now we can still tweak this, and it will all be taken into account with the color ramp besides it, right? So we can now just delete that if we want and play around with the different colors again. The scale as well, so you can just try and get this into the right direction. You can flip these if you want as well and see what looks best for your object, right? I'm just gonna stick with this, otherwise it's gonna take way too long. Something like that looks quite all right. Now, how do we fix those vertical separation segments? Very easy, actually. All we need is another wave texture. So Shift D that, and actually we should have done Ctrl Shift D, delete this, Ctrl Shift D the wave texture. There we go. And let's connect that into the surface first. So Ctrl Shift click that so we can see how that looks. And it's pretty much the same, right? Because it is what we used before. But we can now set this to the Z direction or Y. Let's see what works. Y. And then we can just tweak that scale. Something like this. So we want only a few of these splits and segments. And I'm going to move this entire thing up a little bit. Which means we need another mapping node. So select that, Ctrl Shift D, and swap that into the vector there, because we want to tweak the location and it's going to be the Y direction, because I don't want the first and the last segment to start at the bottom. I want it to be something like maybe a bit more in the middle. We could do the top actually. That doesn't look too bad. There we go. Shift A. Color ramp, right? Because this is way too thick. We need to thin that out a little bit. And it's not gonna work with just one color ramp, right? If we swipe this white all the way to the left, or we can make this value incredibly small 0.001, for example, it is still not small enough. Reason why is because this can only go this far. So let's just add another color ramp right behind that and swipe the whites more to the left once again. Right, so that way you can just get it as small as you want by adding more color ramps. Now I'm gonna want this to be in the bump map as well as in the base color, right? Because if we swap this into the color, let's click the principal BSDF, we're gonna already have some kind of a shadow look there, which looks quite nice, right? Now to bump this up a little bit, we're gonna mix it into the bump node as well. So let's swipe this all to the right and the bump node there to the bottom. And let's just mix the color of the verticals with the color of the horizontals, right? So Shift A, search for a mix color, something we can use. We can also use a math node. Should we use a math node? Let's do it. Delete this, Shift A, math, right? And let's connect it there. And we want to add these two together, right? So now we can get some kind of a bump mapping going on with those stripes as well, which just looks a little bit better, right? And we can control that all we want. So let's select this color ramp and Ctrl Shift D that and select that one there. So now we can control the blacks and the whites. If he thinks this is too strong, just bring them closer, right? Make the black a little bit more grayish and the white a little bit more grayish as well. Right, so we can control easily how this looks. Something like that. Amazing, right? This is a great start. Now, let's just label this all real quick. So this is going to be the vertical part, so the vertical stripes, Control J, and that's F2 that, and name this vertical bump. Beautiful. And the bottom row here, Control J, let's name this horizontal bump. Beautiful. Now we have two of these groups or frames, and we can now focus on the actual color, right? So right now we have one color input, which is the horizontal. Oh, my cat is going wild. This is the horizontal split there, which is what we're going to use later. So let's just disconnect that real quick and worry about the actual shading first, right? So if we zoom in, we need a lot of noisy kind of patterns. It's very old, it's worn down, it's degraded, so we're gonna try and recreate that a little bit. So let's hit Shift A, and the first thing we need is a mixed color, right? If we want multiple color inputs, we usually need a mixed color at some point. And I'm gonna swap that into the base color, and we want one of these colors to be our primary color, right? So let's set this to 0, so to see only the A color, and let's just set this to a nice, beautiful brownish pillar color. And I'm gonna go to the HDRI section, and we already have this set at Whipple Creek. I'm guessing you haven't, so just set your background's color to environment texture, and hit open, and find your HDRI. And I use HDR, I use the Whipple Creek gazebo. All right, and that's already giving us some kind of reflections going on. And now we can just find the factor, right? We want to swap between two colors, add two colors together, create some kind of a noise. And we want that color to be defined by a noise texture, right? So hit Shift A and find a noise texture and connect that up into the vector. There we go. Now hit Shift A and find our color ramp. Oh, color ramp. And Control Shift click that so we can see how it looks. Now usually this is a bit stretched, so hit Control T on that noise texture, and I'm gonna set that to object instead. There we go, and that is looking quite beautiful. Now we can tweak the values, bring this a little bit closer, increase the detail and the roughness a little bit there, and let's set the scale to about 1 and bring this even closer so we get some nice values going on. Right, so imagine this will control your colors, which means that the blacks are going to be the factor A, right? So this color, and the B, the whites, are going to be the white color. So if you want to swap that, we need to swap these colors, but we can make this work, right? Control Shift click the principal BSDF, and here we go, right? So now, right now it's not really visible because we have two very colors that are very close. So let's make this a bit darker there. That's a bit too dark, right? And the reason why we're not seeing anything still is because we can just bring this color ramp a bit closer. Okay, so just bring this closer together and let's see what works the best. Something like that. If it looks too blurry, just increase the roughness more. Here we go, and maybe the detail a bit more as well. Something like that. Now we already have a little bit of a color variation. Maybe make this a bit less brownish. A bit less brownish. Here we go. That's a bit better. And let's set the scale to even lower, like 0.5, right? So this is our primary color ramp that looks quite all right. If we want more noise in there, we can just do the same process, but with a different kind of color, right? So select everything here pretty much. And we want the noise texture to be changed. So Ctrl-Shift-D. There we go. And we can now just add Shift-A, a new mixed color. There. Now our A color is going to be this input and our B color is going to be another input, right? And we want that to be defined by the vector of this noise texture. This noise texture is going to be different. We're going to increase the scale to 3 and let's set this to 4D so we can also control the placement. Shift A, find a color ramp, swap that in between and Ctrl Shift click that, right? So let's see how that looks. I want some detailed noise, some smaller noise here. Beautiful. Let's Ctrl Shift click that mixed node so we can see how that looks as well. All right, so the B color is the white, and I can control this perfectly now. Let's make this a bit darker, maybe something like this, a bit darker, and we can now control exactly the placement of that as well. All right, I want a little bit of that noise coming through, but not too much. Something like this. Let's change the color. Maybe we can even make this a bit more greenish. There we go. And if you now change the W, you can see that the entire texture changes a little bit, right? So you can try to find a nice spot that works well, like that. And then Ctrl Shift click the print spot to see how it looks. It's a bit too green, but it's also because our HDRI, if we go to the world here, is a bit green as well, right? The Whipple Creek gazebo is in a forest, so we can change that by pressing Shift A and find a color, mix color, and set this to color. And now we can just set the second color to be something like blue, right? If we want to represent, for example, the background, the sky, we can make that blue. We can even drag this more to the right. It will become more bluish, which is quite nice in my opinion, right? So we get some kind of a background look. It depends on what you're looking for, of course. So don't go too crazy if that's not what you want. All right, something like this. And I'm going to just rotate this. I'm going to select it, Control T, and we can rotate the HDR a little bit. Doesn't really do much, but you can see that at some points we get just a bit more strong lighting in here, which is what I'm looking for. Something like this. All right, we can even turn this down. If it's too much color still, Shift A and search our hue saturation values right in front there. And let's just change the saturation to 0.5, something like that. It becomes more black and white, right? If we turn this all the way off, it's going to be completely black and white here. And then we add a little bit of a blue color here if we want that, something like, not too much, like this, right? So let's go back to the object shading and we can tweak those colors if we think it's too weird, and to something more brownish there. Beautiful. Right, make that darker, make it lighter, see what works better in your case. Now what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to use the outputs of these color ramps to add into the bump texture here, right? So Shift A and search for, we're actually going to use maybe a mixed color. Let's try matte first. Here we go. Set that to add and let's connect the bump there to the second value. Right, so now you can see that we're adding two values together. This may be too strong, so Shift A, find a color ramp, here we go. And we can just tweak those colors to be a little bit closer. It works, but it may not be the best case. So if you want this to be less strong, you can hit Shift A and find a math node and set this to multiply. And we can just set this value to be lower. Right, so the closer you are to 0, the less you'll see it actually. Something like this works quite well. And now we can even see a little bit of bump shining through there, which is quite nice. For the second one, I'm going to use another math node, Shift A math, and I'm going to set this to maybe multiply, and then connect this one there, right? So multiply will give you a little bit of a different feeling because it's going to multiply the values. Instead of having everything bumpy, you will have some parts that are going to be a bit more smooth, right? And that's controlled by the color ramp. Now let's just hit Shift A and find a math node here, set that to multiply, and let's just tweak that value so we don't have that much. And this doesn't look too good, right? Because we're losing the vertical rows. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to delete this as well. Control X. Oh, that was the wrong one. Control X, Shift A, find our mix color. There we go. And then we can just connect this there into the B. Here we go. And let's hit Shift A, color ramp there. And now we can just tweak those values to be a bit closer. Maybe B-spline. There we go. And it's too strong, which means we just have to bring the values closer again. Right? I told you before, the whites go a bit more to the darks. Something like this. So we only have a bit of that bump going at those strong sections. And we could even invert that. Shift A, invert color there. Which means that now these parts are just going to be more inwards a little bit, right? So we can try and tweak that a little bit. So now it looks like that's actually damaged, right? And that there is material missing from those areas. And that actually looks quite nice and damaged. And now we can even try and tweak the scale if we want, set it to 1, which is going to leave us with larger spots, right? And we can tweak that color ramp and find exactly what we really want to have in the end, right? I think something like this looks quite alright. Now I want some darker shadows in here, so we're gonna mix back up that first horizontal bump that we created here. So let's hit Shift A, mix color, there we go, and we want the vector to be the horizontal bump output, so this one. Connect that up in the vector, and we need to swap this around and then create this black. There we go. So now these values are nice and dark. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Right, so if we want this to be closer, you can just tweak that value right there, and it's gonna make it a bit thinner like that. And same thing for this one, I guess. Make this a bit smaller. There we go. Right, so now we have some nice looking vertical splits. And because we are using the object inputs of the texture coordinates for those noise textures, we can just array this entire pillar into the y direction of like 1.5, and the noise textures are not going to be the same, right? So if you would use the UV map for this, connect that up, you can see that the pillars are exactly the same each single time. And if you use the object, each pillar is going to have a bit different noise textures and stuff like that, right? Which is just beautiful. So that's a very easy and quick way to create those pillars. I hope that helps. So in the end, we have only 20 vertices in this pillar, while it looks quite defined, right? It looks quite detailed, and it is actually not. Well, the texture maybe. So I hope that helps. You can tweak all the values you'd like here, tweak anything at all, and we can just rotate the HDRI, and all of our bump values will be taken into account beautifully, right? If I zoom in here, Control B, draw a section there. If we rotate this, you can see that all the bumpiness and stuff will just change with the lighting of the area, right? Of the HDRI. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And with the sun as well, right? If we rotate this, or the sun, the point light, if you move this around, you can see how it affects your geometry quite nicely, right? Beautiful. I'm going to end it right there. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and then I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.